Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to be diving into a topic that you probably don't think a whole heck of a lot about, but might want to start doing, and that is the gut health of our calves. You probably think it just starts and ends at colostrum, but there is so much more that we can be thinking about in order to help our calves live the best lives, starting from day one. And joining us this afternoon to have this discussion is Jill Soderstrom, who is a National Young Animal Technical Innovations Business Manager with Land O'Lakes. And Jill, we're excited to have you on to really dive into this topic here this afternoon and appreciate your time here with us today. But before we really get into things, would you mind letting us know just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Thank you for having me on. So yes, Jill Soderstrom. I'm actually out in California, but I do support the whole United States. Been with Land O'Lakes for about 6 going on 7 years. So young animals really been my passion here. And the more I work with young animal, the more I've seen that this gut health is really kind of our key. And so that's really my background is thinking of the calf from the inside out, and how we can support them by supporting that gut health.
Well, Jill, I'm excited to dive into things here this afternoon, but I also have to say for folks who are watching live, if you want to engage in today's discussion, please feel free to do so. That is the beauty of the Dairy Signal if you're watching live. And to ask your questions, you head to the bottom of your video screen here and you'll see three dots. You hit those dots and it says ask a question. In that prompt, it will ask you for a name and all that good stuff. If you feel like putting your name, feel free to do so. If you want to be anonymous, that is just fine as well. But engage with today's presenter, and we're excited to really dive into things here this afternoon. I know we got a lot of great content to get through. So, with all of that being said, Jill, I'm going to pass it over to you to get us started.
Sounds great. Thank you. All right, let me see if I can get my screen cleared up here. Okay, so today, yes, we're going to focus on this gut health, and calf health. And what I really want to think of, I call it Goldilocks. Stole this from the adult cow guys on their Goldilocks, but the same concept. Thinking about, is there too much, is there too little, but what's really just right? And so I have this kind of discussion that I like to have with producers. So I really do hope that this is kind of producer focused. That's something you can use on your farm. And I really want to help guide us through what's the right technology for your system. So kind of thinking of questions that we can ask for our specific farm system itself, and not just really super generalized ideas. So the first question we're going to really dive into is helping you think through, do you need technologies on your farm? What do you actually need? And then I'm going to cover some of the main technologies, kind of just overview of what's out there in the industry, so you can understand maybe a little bit better of all these things, these prebiotics, probiotics, all these fancy things we talk about, what they are and what they're really doing for our calves. Then I want to touch on supporting versus stimulating. I know, even in the human health industry, we hear a lot of things of, take this to help support, take this to help stimulate. So I want to talk about, again, on this Goldilocks concept, the right balance of what we're looking for to do in our calves. And then I want to touch on compatibility. We need to think through, if we're talking about adding multiple things into that gut of our calf, are these compatible? And how we can kind of think about making sure we're adding the right ingredients together. So again, this first thing, do we really need technologies? And I want to talk to you about the cost of the immune system. Obviously, when we talk about calves, a lot of times when we're talking about feeding them, we're just talking about gains. We're talking about how much feed we're putting into that calf, what kind of gains are we getting out of them. But there's another cost, another thing that's taking energy that we need to be considering. And that is immune activation. So when we think of our immune system, I think we can think of this similar to, like the army. Every country, so the United States, we have an army, and every day of the year there are soldiers out there. We own ammunition, we own planes, we own these things. But if we're not at war, we're not using a lot of them. We're not putting a lot into that. If we do go to war, all of a sudden we need more soldiers. We are recruiting soldiers. We are, buying more ammunition. We are building more planes. And that's kind of how our immune system works. It's always active. So part of our maintenance energy we're using is always going to be there. But the cost of activating and really needing to drive that immune system is quite costly. So you might be asking, okay, so what's actually going to activate this immune system? When am I going to have this, higher energy use? And honestly, this can be a lot of different things. Just simple things like dehorning and castrating. Obviously, things like injuries, a hurt leg, broken legs, but things like pathogens. When our body sees pathogens in the environment, that's going to activate our immune system. Then things like weather, just the changing in weather, flip-flopping back and forth from warm to cold. Cold stress causes it, heat stress causes it. So all of these things can impact activating our immune system. Vaccines. While vaccines are beneficial to our animal, they do trigger the immune system, and there is some cost to that. And then the last one, kind of thinking transportation. A lot of calves are on trucks these days. A lot of calves are moving around the countryside. And just that activity does tend to activate that immune system. It kind of turns that immune system on in our calves. So, again, that first question, kind of thinking of how this impacts your farm. So, the first thing you think of, where does your farm fit into this? Are you raising calves that are coming in on a truck? What's your weather like in your area? What's the hygiene on your farm? If you have commingled calves, what kind of pathogen load are those calves facing? There's no right or wrong system, but just think about your system as we get into this. And so again, so the cost of this immune system. So when I talk about cost, I'm talking about energy or essentially active calories. And so we kind of think of the whole body holistically. So the first thing when we have an active immune system is going to be kind of that central nervous system. And the first thing we have is a fever. So when you think of a fever, think of rubbing your hands together to create heat. That's what your body's doing. Your body's creating heat, and that heat takes energy, just like if you stood there and rub your hands to create energy. But then on the flip side, we tend to have anorexia. So our calves aren't even eating food. So we're spending energy to create heat for that fever at a time that that brain is saying, I'm not hungry, I'm not going to eat. So we're not even taking in the amount of calories that we're putting in front of that calf. The next part is kind of going in, thinking about inside that gut. And when our immune system is activated, most of that immune system is kind of living through the bloodstream. So we actually have a redistribution of our blood flow. So instead of blood going to the gut, a lot of that blood goes to the periphery. And because of the lack of blood to our gut, we can see things like leaky gut. We're actually damaging those intestine cells. They start to kind of break apart. That's when we get leaky gut and things can come into the body that are not supposed to pass through that cell wall. And another thing is because that gut is meant to be helping absorb nutrients. If that gut wall is damaged, often we aren't absorbing nutrients. So now we have calves that might not be eating, so they're not even eating their full ration. And now they also can't absorb all those nutrients. Then on top of that, I'm sorry, the story's just going to get worse for a little while. On top of that, we see insulin resistance. So where our normal body, we see glucose from, things like milk replacer and starter, we bring that in, use that energy into the body. That's where our calves start to grow. We have insulin resistance, so we're actually not taking up all that glucose. At the same time, we have lipolysis and muscle catabolism. So essentially, the muscle and tissue, fat tissue that's already in that body will actually start breaking that down and utilizing that and shunting that to the immune system. So here we're thinking of a time where we're trying to grow our calf, and the active immune system is actually going to start eating those energies straight off of our calf's body. And the last one is when we think about our liver. When the immune system's going, especially when we have pathogens in the system, that immune system actually starts sequestering things like iron, zinc, and calcium. It's keeping those away from letting bad pathogens grow, but it also means, unfortunately, that at that time it's not allowing those to get into the calf's body where they need those to grow. And in that liver, we're going to start also having these acute phase proteins. So these are proteins that are going to help surveil the body. So they go around through the bloodstream. They're really important when we're sick because they can help identify things that are a problem, and they kind of go around and signal. They say, we have a problem here, and they go direct our immune system how to fix it. So they're useful, but as the name says, they're proteins. And so it takes energy to create them. So I want to dive in a little bit deeper here on two of these things. I have highlighted the muscle catabolism and these acute phase proteins, because as we're talking about the cost, I want to tell you a little bit more specifically about the cost of protein in this immune system. So thinking about these little acute phase proteins, they may be cute, but they're very costly to our body. So thinking about this proteins very specifically. So when we think of our calf, we've got muscle tissue. We know that that muscle is built from proteins, and within those proteins, we have all of these little linked amino acids. So here, this little chain represents all those amino acids making up a protein. And then, so in this animal that has that activated immune system, we're creating these acute phase proteins. And those also, they're proteins made up of a bunch of amino acids. Well, the problem here is that when you look at, say, these little blue ones, we actually have a very different makeup in our muscle protein of different amino acids than what those acute phase proteins are made of. So those limiting amino acids, so cysteine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, tyrosine, those are all in actually fairly low concentration in our muscle, but they're in really high concentration in these acute phase proteins. So we actually need almost 4 times as much muscle protein if we're breaking that down to make these acute phase proteins. So it's actually a really inefficient cost to make these acute phase proteins. So again, we need them if we have this activated immune system, but it's really costly to our animal. And again, think we're trying to grow this animal as efficiently as possible. So if we have this activated immune system, this is really detrimental to that growth process. This is one of those reasons why one of the biggest things is we want to think about preventing this immune response, because these are very costly process. And the second part, and I promise pretty soon we're looking at the good side, but one more of these kind of unfortunate things that we need to think through is the other part. So the cost of the immune system, thinking specifically about glucose or carbohydrates. And the example I'm going to show is adult cow. I think it's just kind of a clean, easy way to look at this, but it illustrates it really nice. So if we look at heat-stressed cows, I think at this point everyone fairly understands. When we have cows, adult lactating dairy cows that are heat stressed, we know that we tend to see a milk production decrease. So the graph here is showing our dry matter intake over time. And the two groups here, the PF, so that solid line, is pair-fed animals compared to heat-stressed animals. So the dotted line were dairy cows that were put in a normal situation and they were heat stressed. And the curve response here is their natural response that we know when a cow is heat stressed, she eats less. So this just shows us that exactly what we expect. Heat stressed animal going to eat less. And then we took that pair-fed group. So that group was in a normal thermoneutral situation, so comfortable environment. And then we manually reduced their intake. So this group of animals was kind of forced to eat less, but to match that what a heat stressed animal would do. So this is we're just kind of looking at that input output. So we saw overall both of these groups were managed to eat about 37% less dry matter intake. And then they measured the dry matter response of this group. And so looking at the milk production, again, that dotted line are those heat stressed animals, exactly as we would expect. As they get heat stressed, they eat less, we produce less milk. So this was where we wanted to see, is the reduction in dry matter intake matching the calorie output of milk production and that loss of milk production? Well, according to this, those pair-fed animals that had the same dry matter intake, while the heat stressed animals lost 40% of their milk production, Those pair-fed animals that were in a comfortable environment but just had a reduced intake only reduced their milk production by 20%. So this study showed that somewhere between 35 and 50% of that milk production response isn't accounted for by just the dry matter intake. So the initial question, the study was done in about 2009. At this point, we're saying, what's going on? Why is there a greater milk production loss in these heat stressed animals? And what this study really helped be a foundation, and now we really understand that loss, that missing energy that was lost that wasn't in the milk production, was going into the immune system. The immune system was taking the rest of that energy that we weren't seeing in those heat stressed animals. And we actually now know across all mammals, it's actually a pretty conserved number. So this would impact you and me if we have an immune response. This would impact your dog. It would impact pigs the same. We actually our immune system utilizes about 1 gram of glucose on a kilogram per body weight to the 0.75, which I don't expect anyone to be able to do the math off the top of their head, per hour. But I did that math. So for these adult dairy cows that we just talked about, when you math out your average kind of Holstein dairy cow, that actually comes out to about 3.5 pounds of glucose a day. So think of in your kitchen cabinet, pounds of sugar, just sugar that the immune system is using when it's activated. So that's what was happening in those heat stressed animals. And when we think about how much glucose it takes to make milk, it takes about 7 to 8 pounds of glucose to make 110 pounds of milk. So you can see where a lot of that loss of production is because that immune system is robbing a very significant part of that glucose in that animal. So now getting back to calves, if we scale that to a calf body weight, that means a calf is going to use about 1/2 pound of just glucose a day when their immune system is fully activated. So if you think for a second what we're actually feeding a calf, think of maybe our 14-day-old calf, not eating a lot of starter, just mostly on a milk or a milk replacer. If we're feeding that calf, say, only 1 pound of solids, if they need 1/2 pound of just glucose, we are not giving them enough. We will not have enough energy to feed the immune system and our calf. And if you kind of are looking at these numbers and you're saying, I think this lady doesn't know what she's talking about, this seems too extreme, that number seems too large, I want to show you an example of real life calves where we actually kind of really see this response. So when we look at the energy demand of that immune system, this was a nice study done at Cornell where they looked at the effect of crypto on calves. What they did was they took calves at day 1, so actually day 1 of life, they fed them all colostrum. At day 3, all of these calves, so it was during their 5th feedings, that's what the F's mean up there, they were inoculated with a very heavy dose of crypto. I think if anybody on here has dealt with calves, you know that a really heavy dose of crypto is definitely going to trigger that immune system. Followed these calves out at day 7, and we saw, that's kind of when you hit that peak of that onset of shedding. And then out to day 11 is, we really hit that peak. So day 7 to 11 is kind of that critical window where that immune system is really ramping up. And then they followed these calves all the way out to day 21, where they assumed that most calves were, crypto was going to self-resolve at that point. So over this 21-day period, the only intervention was feeding 2 different planes of nutrition. So this was really to tease out how much nutrition these calves need when their immune system is activated. So one of these groups was fed what we'd kind of consider a conventional, or I hope at this point, kind of an old school way of feeding 1 pound of powder a day. This was a 2020 milk replacer. The other group of calves was fed a high plane of nutrition. So this was 2.5 pounds of powder a day, and this was going to be a 28-20. Only difference was these 2 feed rates. All calves, when they started scouring, were offered electrolytes, just like you would on a conventional farm. So they were not limited in their electrolyte intake or anything like that, but just feeding different amounts of food. And so what they saw, first thing they looked at was pack cell volume. So pack cell volume obviously is going to be showing us the extent that these calves are hydrated or dehydrated. We want a lower value. Lower is going to be more hydrated. As we get higher, that's going to be dehydrated. And so we look at our two groups. And again, so that control calves, the calves that were only fed a pound, they had some pretty significant dehydration. And remember, we hit that 7 to 11 days is when we really have our peak. And that's really what we saw. We saw this big peak here as those calves are really shedding a lot of really heavy scours. But I think what's most interesting is that we also saw that that level of dehydration continued even as these calves resolved from that scouring phase and resolved from that crypto infection. Whereas feeding that higher plane of nutrition, that these calves were able to feed the immune system and feed themselves. And so they were able to maintain that level of hydration. They hit maybe a little bit of dehydration, but especially by the end, they were back to a normal, healthy hydration status. One of the things to note is that those calves that had the high plane of nutrition, they resolved from their scours 10 times faster. And I think we can see that pretty clearly with that pack cell volume, that they were able to get over it faster. And because they weren't scouring, we didn't have quite that issue with the dehydration later on. Something that's super interesting, this goes back to if you didn't believe me before about how much glucose and how much energy these calves are using. This is looking at average daily gain over that first 21-day period. On the left, if you can see that dotted line that goes across the middle, that's zero. That is zero average daily gain. Anything below that means those calves were losing weight. The control calves that were only fed 1 pound of powder a day lost 0.1 pounds every single day on average. Those calves were lighter at day 21 than they were at their birth. On the other side, those calves that were fed a high plane of nutrition, they gained almost a pound a day. So if you're familiar with that 2.5 pounds, that is still definitely lower than we would expect with that amount of feeding. But again, when you see how much that immune system is taking, it's taking so much that 1 pound of powder was not enough to let these calves grow. The immune system will take energy first, and if there's any left over, it can go to the calf for growing. But if not, the immune system will rob it. And this is exactly why we can have high mortality when our calves aren't being fed enough and they have these high immune system challenges, because the immune system will use up more energy than we're giving those calves. So again, this is really where that preventative comes into play. And this is where, again, stepping back, thinking about your facility and your farm. Are your animals under a lot of stress? Do they have a lot of these immune system challenges? Because a part of that is if you have higher immune challenges, we really want to make sure we're supporting those calves, both nutritionally, that's going to be our foundation, getting enough total calories into them. But as we go further in this conversation, we're going to talk about technologies that can help prevent these as well. So that first question, everyone, I'd like you to think, do my calves experience any stress? I'm going to just go with you're going to say yes. If you have a farm where you say no, please call me. I'd love to see a farm that has zero stress. But even, the best of us, even the best systems, just it's nature. Our animals don't always read the book. So we all do have some level of stress. So the question really is how much? Smaller herds where your animals aren't moving, you have the ability to, keep calves maybe a little bit warmer in the winter, those kind of things. Less commingling where you're not bringing as much pathogens onto your farm. Even the best systems, you do have some stress, but maybe you're on the other side and maybe you have a larger system. Calves are commingled, calves are moving, inclement weather, all of those things. If you're on the higher side, there's nothing wrong with that, but we can help kind of think through some ways that on your farm you can help support these calves. So let's talk about what those technologies are. And I'm going to kind of try to keep this nice and high level, just the concepts of these things, and not dive into any products or anything, but just starting to get you guys some things to think about. And one of the things, again, thinking this too much, too little, we want to make sure this is where I'm saying the question is, Are we feeding too little? Because again, thinking about all those things we just talked about, one of the things we first want to do is how can we reduce the cost of that immune response? What are things we can do to prevent the calf from even needing to make those acute phase proteins or pull those, pull that muscle, the amino acids from our muscle? How can we prevent that in the first place? And the two I want to focus on today are going to be our prebiotics and our probiotics. And I'm going to focus on those is because those are probably the absolutely most common that you're going to see. Anybody walking onto your farm, I guarantee somebody has come and talked to you guys about these. So our prebiotics, these are going to be things, you'll hear them called yeast cultures, moss, mono-oligosaccharides, beta-glucans, phos, which are fructo-oligosaccharides. In general, these are parts of yeast that are no longer alive. Most of the prebiotics out there, they kind of are in two camps. Some of them are going to be what we would consider food for our active microbials or probiotics. So they actually help feed our gut bugs. And then some of them are really they're going to be there to help support the immune function. When we think about probiotics, so pro meaning life, these are also called active microbials or DFM, direct fed microbials. Essentially, these are all the same. They are all live microorganisms. A lot of times we just call them bugs for short. The majority of these, when we're talking about calves, are going to be live bacteria. Live yeast is considered a probiotic, but that's more of a rumen function. So we tend to have that either in our older heifers or our adult cows. But overall, these probiotics are going to be used to help improve nutrient utilization. So they are some of those bugs that are digesting feed in our gut and helping break down that feed. But also probiotics also can help support our immune system. And the reason I always talk about these together is because if you want to think about, maybe think about a fish pond in your backyard. You have a fish pond, and when we stock that fish pond, we think about what we're putting in there. When you add a live organism, so if you add some koi fish to that pond, your live organism, that's like adding your probiotic. You're putting specific live things into that system. But then, depending on what you put in there, if you have goldfish in a tank, if you have, large koi outside, if you have, little sucker fish, whatever, they all want to eat different feed. So that's where our prebiotic comes in. That's what the feed we're putting in there to support that specific fish. You get little flakes if you're feeding a goldfish. Koi like these big pellets. Everybody has a different preference. So we need to make sure those are compatible. And then you also need to think about that system. If you have saltwater fish, you're going to be putting different things in there. For our koi, we want to think about how that environment is, making sure the water and the whole ecosystem is clean. So that's where some of that prebiotics come into play as well, making sure that whole system is all working well. So to me, when we talk about prebiotics and probiotics, we have to talk about them together because we can't talk about where you're going to buy a fish and not talk about the pond or the system that you're going to be putting it into. And then, so we just talked about, okay, we have a couple different ideas about what kind of fish to buy. Well, this really is kind of the same case if we're talking about what kind of probiotics we're going to put into the gut of our calf. So this is where strains come into play. And most of these probiotic companies, we really understand that strain matters. So when we think about strain, I'm going to give you an example with cows because I think we all will understand this. So if you think of that kind of family tree, so genus is Bos, and then we can think about species level. So if we think about a Bos taurus, that's going to be like our Holstein cow. If we think about something like a Bos indicus, so these are different species. It's still a cow. We would all say, oh, look, that's a Brahma, but it's a cow. But if we compare a Holstein and a Brahma, I think most of us can totally understand there's some similarities, but they're different animals, okay? So now let's go down to two species. So now we're looking at both Bos taurus. So if we go down to strain, if we think about still thinking of our cattle, this is kind of more like when we get to breed. So now we have our Bos taurus, and now we're thinking our Holstein. Well, Belgian blue is also a Bos taurus. I have never seen somebody milk a Belgian blue. It's probably possible, but they're still quite different than our Holstein. So we can see here the strain really matters. And we could say, okay, what about Jersey? Okay, we're getting closer, but still, the strain really matters. So, to give you an example with our probiotics, since that's what we're actually feeding to our calves, we can think of a Bacillus subtilis. I can almost bet that anybody watching this has had somebody come on their farm and offered that they have a Bacillus subtilis for your calves. It's a very common organism, but the key is I'm using an example. I'm not trying to not call out a product. Um, but when you talk to these probiotic companies and people supporting probiotics, they should be able to have a strain name. Sometimes it'll be a branded name. Sometimes it'll just be a group of letters. Here, I just use an example, XY1. It's pretty common to have the something kind of to do with your company or brand name and then a number. But it's a registered strain name. So we can have a strain that's very specifically selected for dairy cattle or dairy calves that's been fed in these animals that we know has an impact in these animals. Because I could bring you Bacillus subtilis G1, and that strain is also probably in your kitchen if you have moldy bread. Because Bacillus subtilis G1 is a strain of bacillus that grows on bread, but it won't do anything for your calf. So it's really important that when we're talking about these strains, we're thinking about, has this strain been fed to cattle? Has it been fed to calves? What is the benefit in calves? There are some strains that work across species. There are some strains that'll work in an adult cow and a calf and a pig and a chicken. But there's some strains that work really well in, maybe pigs and poultry, but they don't work in calves or ruminants. So it's really important to know what strain we're using, make sure the data that we're talking about is the data of that same strain, and that it's going to be relevant and work in your animals. And just to think about when we're talking about a lot of this is prevention as well. We also want to think about if we're talking about preventing pathogens, that we're looking at preventing pathogens that are relevant in our calves. So same thing, salmonella. Everybody knows your vet comes out, I've got, sick calves. What do they have? Oh, they have salmonella. Everybody has salmonella. Guarantee every single farm we can find salmonella on. But what you should be having that conversation with your veterinarian, with your nutritional consulting, those who are helping you if you're trying to find the problem. What strain of salmonella do I have? Because if you have Heidelberg, that's going to be problematic, right? That can be a pretty significant strain that's causing issues. If you were to find that you have something like Salmonella enterica infantis, if we're talking cattle, it's not going to be a big issue. Salmonella infantis would be a big issue if you have poultry, but that specific strain isn't actually problematic and doesn't, really make our calves sick. So this is where, when we're thinking about what's our probiotic going to do, if somebody says, "Oh, I have a Bacillus subtilis that helps, Salmonella infantis," you're going to say, "Well, that's not a problem on my farm." So I'm not really sure how that's relevant. So both sides of this, the prebiotics, probiotics, but also thinking about what we're actually trying to prevent here too, getting down to that strain specific. So not all of our probiotics are the same. And thinking back to our fish, they all live in different environments. We know with fish, some of them are surface feeders, lower feeders. Oop, I'm getting weird messages. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm getting a weird message. My audio's not working.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Are you
That's
seeing
very
the weird
strange.
pop
But
up?
yeah,
Message that my audio is not connected.
so
Okay,
far you're still doing good.
perfect. And we'll keep going. Apologize for that. Um, so yes, so we have, fish that live in different areas, and because they live in different areas, they're going to eat different feed, and our probiotics are going to be the same. So different probiotics are going to live in different regions of the gut or the rumen. Some of them really like to nestle in that rumen wall. Some of them like to kind of live up more, in the fluid there. And so same thing, we need to feed them the right food. We need to feed them a food that's going to be compatible with them. So that's going to be our prebiotic there. And then something to note is they also produce different byproducts. So what we get out of that combination can be good, can be not good, but it's something we need to think about that we're creating the right byproduct also when we feed them. So we've already kind of talked about, again, kind of keep this in the back of your mind the whole time. Where's my system fit in this? Am I a higher stress, lower stress? What are the things that I need to focus on helping my calves? And then as we think about, okay, how's a probiotic going to fit into my system? Again, we want to think about the strain, not just species, get all the way down to the strain. And is there research on calves with this strain? Because something that works, again, in adult cows might not necessarily work in calves. Some of them do, but we need to make sure there's research that's been done that has shown it has an impact. And then what are the benefits? What am I actually getting out of this? Is this something that helps with a problem I don't have? We don't all have the same problem. So is this probiotic solving an issue that I am currently experiencing? And then getting back a little bit to prebiotics. I'm pretty much just going to say it's complicated. So just trust me on this. I'll show you how complicated it is. Today, you don't need to take away all of this, except right there. It's complicated. But just to give you a little bit of an idea. So think of a yeast, a little yeast cell, very small. If we take just that cell wall, so remember our prebiotics are essentially killed parts of the yeast. So if we take that whole yeast, we can pull the inside out of it, and that's what we call yeast extract. A little bit more common in our adult cow rations than with our young animal. But the guts of that yeast can be fed as a yeast cell or yeast extract. Then if we take that cell, we can feed the whole yeast cell. We can just take all of it. That's an option. We can, oh my, I'm getting more pop-ups. Um, we can take the cell wall and then we can break it down. So remember I said there's a couple different things we can feed as our probiotics. And that can be our mannins. So that can be one of these components. We can have beta glucans. We can get the FOS out of this. And so there's all different levels of how we can pull these apart and feed very, very small components. We can have larger components of this all mixed together. But just in general, just understand there's a lot of options. So again, as we're thinking about what's right for my farm, just think about what components, there's a lot of questions you should be asking and information that somebody should be able to share with you about what these are instead of just saying, it's a probiotic, it'll work great on your farm. So when we think of these prebiotics, we want to think about, what's the component and the source? Again, you don't need to be educated on that, but whoever is trying to suggest that this fits in your system should understand, where these products came from, what the source, what part of this, cell wall we're feeding. And then obviously, what's the intended use and benefits? And I'll touch on a little bit of those in a little bit here. Because when we think of both of these products, prebiotics and probiotics, this is where kind of getting on that other side of the just right versus too much. We talked about both of these have the opportunity to kind of help support that immune system. And we want to make sure we are supporting the immune system and not stimulating the immune system. So again, our Goldilocks, too much, too little, just right. There is an opportunity to do too much. And if we don't understand how these work and we don't understand our own situation, we have the ability to do too much. So let me kind of guide you through some things to think about of feeding kind of maybe just right amount of these things. So we talked about prebiotics. One of the options is kind of that food for our good bacteria. Things like FOS are often going to be considered the food for our bacteria, but those other cell wall components can also be food for our good bacteria. And so going back to our fish in a tank or our koi fish analogy, again, so we're thinking about in our calf, we have all these microbes, these bugs that we want to feed. And just like if we had fish in a tank, we want to feed it the right food. Absolutely. But again, we're in a confined environment. So if we have a goldfish at home, and if any of you have had the joy of coming home with a goldfish from the county fair or whatever, it's really important that you really just give it a couple pinches of food. If we dump a whole bunch of food in there, we actually can damage the environment. We can overfeed that bug and we can literally contaminate the environment. So there really is too much of a good thing because when we're talking about our prebiotics and probiotics, remember we also talked about these byproducts. Well, when our bacteria eat these prebiotics, they create VFAs, and we do need VFAs, right? That is how our ruminants work. They are creating the food that our animal actually absorbs. So we do want to encourage that, but we also need to remember that we also get things like CO2 and methane. So carbon dioxide and methane are part of that equation too. So we need to find the right level of that just enough amount of VFAs, but not too much of the CO2 and methane because we all know that those can have these negative impacts on our animal. Specifically, this is where we can see sometimes that overfeeding our calves, we can actually, if we do too much of these technologies, we can actually see things like bloat. Sometimes this is why we see a little bit of a tummy upset if we add a new pre or probiotic in there, because sometimes there's just a little adjustment period. So a small bit of GI upset isn't abnormal, but it's something we definitely need to be watching for and making sure we're not overdoing it again. We don't want to stimulate too much of this impact. Thinking about again, going back to thinking about these acute phase proteins. So I said they are important, right? We need them when we have this immune response, but we want to think about what's enough and what's too much, what's supporting versus what's going to be stimulating that immune system. So here we have this little gloopy guy here on the left. This is going to be a macrophage. So this is one of those immune cells that we all have, these guys just floating through our body. They're running through our bloodstream 24 hours a day. Everybody has them. What they do is they're kind of just going around looking for they're kind of that mall cop, security guard. They're looking for things. If they see a problem, they're going to raise an alarm and have other people come help. So if we look at the bottom here, and just kind of a graphical look of our immune response. If we've got our guy here, no immune response, nothing's happening, and then all of a sudden a pathogen enters our bloodstream or our system. This little guy, he's going to have a response. So we're going to get a little blip there in our immune response. But when he's not trained, that immune response isn't going to be all that successful. He's going to take a minute. He's going to say, hey, is that good? Is that bad? He's going to be a little slow in his response. It's not really going to be necessarily a helpful response because remember, especially in our young calves, we have this naive immune system. So remember, it's all there. It's just not trained. So it really doesn't know what's going on. It doesn't know. It's still learning self versus these pathogens and these bad things. So what we can do is we can add these beta glucans. Remember, that's a small bit of that yeast cell wall. We can add beta glucans, and this is something we do ahead of time. So this is why these prebiotics can be fed typically kind of every calf every day in that beginning of life, because what they're going to do when fed at the correct level is they will go and that macrophage is going to look at that and say, you know what, I need to learn something. And it triggers it does trigger a small immune response, but what it does is it helps those macrophage learn how to send out cytokines, which then those cytokines are what are going to tell our liver to create those acute phase proteins. So it's kind of like a practice round. So we don't have a constant, it's not constant if we're feeding this at the right level. But what it means is that when we then have this pathogen come in, now we have a nice trained response. Now that security guard in our body says, hey, right away, I know that this is bad. I'm going to go deal with it. I know who to call. I have the phone number on speed dial and it's ready. So that's the security guard we want. It's confident, it's able to identify things, and it's able to, what's most important, contact the right person quickly. But this is, remember, we're talking about getting the right balance. This is where we have that potential to overstimulate things. So if we overstimulate, if we add too much of these prebiotics, we get the risk of, essentially kind of like roid rage. We can tell these macrophages too much and they get too busy and their immune, they actually are causing the immune response even though nothing's happening. So this is that right balance. This is where more isn't always better. So thinking about if we're feeding these technologies, we want to make sure they're fed at a level that's been tested in animals and that we've looked at. This is a good long-term impact. We don't overstimulate the immune system with this feeding level. There are going to be times, again, we're think about your specific situation. There are products where it is beneficial to feed it maybe at a 2x dose for a certain period of time. But we want to make sure that that product has been tested in, extra sick animals, or maybe at a time we know maybe pen moves, or we're bringing animals onto the farm, a time we know that those animals are going to be under a larger stress load. But again, we just need to make sure we've tested these products in calves and we understand where your situation fits and that we're not doing something that we're going to overstimulate. So finding that nice balance of protection. So that last part, when we're thinking about our calves, the products I'm thinking about using, have what's the right dose for, if I'm giving this every calf every day, what's the right dose if I'm giving this to sick versus healthy calves? There are products that are meant to feed, in your milk replacer, every calf every day. But there are also products that are meant to be fed maybe for a shorter duration, but at a higher level. And it's important to make sure we feed those correct and we understand your specific farm as we're doing that. The last bit here is compatibility. So I think we talked about, pretty clearly. So we're talking about a whole bunch of options, right? We have our potential for maybe a couple prebiotics. There's all those different prebiotics. We can have multiple strains of probiotics. There's things I didn't touch on, but things like our essential oils or phytogens, those play into the immune system. So we really need to think about how these all come into play because at the end of the day, we're feeding these to the calf all at the same time. So this study, I feel like I need to send this author a thank you because this study actually didn't turn out how they wanted. This study was looking at Holstein calves. As you can see, they were being fed milk replacer and a starter. And what this group did is they took two different products. They took a botanical extract that was proven, good research that has shown it's a commercially available product that shows that it enhanced dry matter intake and gut health. So nice, sounds good, something worthwhile to feed in calves. And then they took direct fed microbials. Again, this was a product that was commercially available, had data in calves. Data showed that it can improve gut health and growth performance. So this group said 1+1 should absolutely equal 2. Like this, these sound like two very good things. There's evidence that they work in calves. So we think that adding the two of these will be synergistic. We think we will have a benefit. 1+1 = 2, maybe even 3. Sometimes we even get, a greater response. So they said, how does this work if we're going to feed these two together? So remember, BE is going to be our botanical extract. EX is going to be that direct fed microbial. So what they looked at, dry matter intake, a starter. So this blue line here is control. So those calves received none of these products. The orange and the gray line were the calves that were fed. The orange is just going to be the botanical extract, and that EX is going to be just that probiotic. And then the yellow line is going to be the feeding combination. So looking at this to me doesn't look that great. There was a significant reduction in starter intake with the combination. So overall, there's some changes with the other two. A little bit of a benefit when you dig into the data of those individual, similar to control, but we saw a reduction in dry matter intake when we added the two together. And when you first look at this, you say, okay, maybe cross my fingers. Maybe this was a time where they ate less, but they still grew the same at least, right? You know, there's efficiency plays that we could have here. But unfortunately, when you look at body weight, same thing. The two products individually fed pretty similar to the control, but when you combine them, we saw a lower body weight gain. So we definitely did not see a change in energy efficiency here. We actually saw that they ate less and grew less well. So in two products that have worked together in calves, actually, when fed together, this group saw that they were antagonistic. They actually had a lower production volume than those control animals. So these calves are better off getting nothing than getting the combination of these two products. And this is where thinking about compatibility and knowing that our products work well is so important, because we can't just say one good product from one company, one good product from another. I'm just going to assume that they both work together, because it doesn't always happen. I'm going to show you one more example. This is from actually something that our group worked on. We had, again, that strain specific, our ETC lab. So they look at all different species. They make products for different species and very specific things. And they were asked to create a product with they wanted a combination of probiotic bacteria, and they wanted to look at a combination of a couple bugs that they really wanted to target with this product. And so our initial diagnosis was we were using these bacteria plates where we look at zone of inhibition. So we take a plate and we rub it with bad pathogens. And in those little wells, you add the DFM. And if that DFM or that direct fed microbial prevents the growth, then we see a nice clear spot. If not, then all that bad pathogens can grow around it. So we want a large, what we call zone of inhibition. So for this, we took, and I have here, again, not kind of going into product names, but a whole bunch of different bacillus strains that we wanted to look at. And then so the first thing was Clostridium. So these were our top contenders. These were the top strains that had been effective against Clostridium. So it said, okay, that's going to be our target for that. So now let's look at some Salmonella. So this was specifically going to be looking at something that was going to be in calves. So again, we want to make sure that we're looking at strains that are impacting the species we're talking about. So these were all pathogenic Salmonella strains found in dairy calves. So we took a couple of our key probiotic and we said, how much are they preventing? You don't have to understand these numbers. This was essentially millimeters of prevention, but these were all, again, top contenders, very efficient at reducing Salmonella growth. Great. Okay, but we said this product, we wanted to have a couple strains. So you'll notice we've got 50-50, we've got the K6 and 39 here. So we put a bunch of these combinations together, and I want to point out the second from the bottom. That 50-50 and the 39 had worked really well together before. Individually, they both prevented Salmonella growth pretty efficiently. When we combined them, they had zero efficacy with preventing Salmonella. So this is why it's incredibly important to make sure that we're doing some pre-work, that we know that products that are being fed to an animal together are going to be compatible when they're in that animal. And I will say, because somebody will probably ask or somebody's thinking of it, The zone of inhibition isn't 100%, but it's definitely a safe way to say, you know what, if they don't work together when they're next to each other, it's just not worth it. When you have other options, this is just a snippet of the data for this. When you have other options that when you see them next to each other, they're still working effectively. That's definitely a good place to start again. But I really think it's important that the next step is then trialing these in animals, actually seeing that there's a benefit when we feed these to our animals. So, kind of to wrap this all up, again, thinking about our combination of technologies. Have these been tested together? Have they actually been fed in combination together? So, when we're thinking of this, to wrap this all up, on your farm, first, you're going to think about how are my calves? Are my calves healthy? Do they need a lot of support? Mostly just kind of, you know, maybe just a little bit of support when those little things happen, or do I really need to focus on really helping get these calves through commingling and weather and all these different events? Then, once we have an idea of the extent we want to support our calves, thinking about these prebiotics and probiotics. Again, probiotics, both these products, have they been tested in calves? Is the data in calves? And similar situations to mine, is there data on high stress animals versus what my calves are, etc. Thinking again, are we talking about products that are specifically for every calf every day? So are generally healthy calves, or are we talking about thinking of a product that we need for just during a scouring phase or just during a specific phase where our calves are off? And then at the end of the day, we're now thinking about all these different products and have they been tested together? Because the last thing to consider is that at the end of the day, we're putting everything into our calf at one time. So any technologies that are in your milk, anything we're adding to our milk, so any of those little hand ads that's going into that bottle and going to go into that gut. Also, thinking about our electrolytes. There's a whole bunch of different electrolytes out there, and some of them now we have some different technologies in there. Some electrolytes have prebiotics and probiotics, but those are all, at the end of the day, going into the gut of our calf. So are these all compatible? Any of these gels or pastes, whether it's that day one thing we're putting into our calf, if it's something that we're giving, a paste we're giving to a calf, at 14 days or at scouring. Again, it's all still going into that stomach at the same time. Any of those additives, anything we're putting in starter, because there's a significant portion where that calf's diet is both milk and starter. So anything that touches the mouth and goes into the gut of our calf, we need to think about holistically, kind of from a whole program approach. So we can't just say, okay, I'm going to focus on the right prebiotics and probiotics for my milk program, but not pay attention to what I'm putting in my starter, because at the end of those days, those also need to be compatible. So we really just need to think of our calf on this holistic approach, how we can support it, because once we support and have as much of that prevention as we can get, then we leave our calf open to have that improved growth performance. We're not robbing that energy like we talked about early. We're not robbing glucose and we're not robbing protein. And we know that this benefit has long-term impacts. We know that when we're talking about our replacement heifers, that these calves, if we help improve that early average daily gain, that we get more milk production on the end. We know, and we're seeing more data with our crossbreds, that how this early life is going to impact the ability to be more efficient in the feedlot, marble better, all those things. We know that this early life impacts how that calf is going to grow out at the end of the day. So there's a significant benefit of thinking through what our calves really need. And I get it's hard because it's inside the calf and it's not as easy to measure something like growth. But at the end of the day, really thinking of what's happening inside that calf, I think it's going to be a really big benefit. And so the goal is thinking about, what's just right, not too much, but also not too little. And we can make some really great calves doing it this way.
Well,
Thank you.
Jill, I just have to say thank you so much. I know we are right on the dot for time, so I want to ask you, do you still have time for a few questions or do you got to run right away?
I do. I have time.
Okay, wonderful. We did have a couple questions come in, but I want to start from one of the questions I have first, just because it's very much encompassed in this discussion that you just had with just right and compatibility. When thinking about, these options, say you're starting something, whether that's prebiotics, probiotics, or anything in between, and you've had this opportunity to really see how it interacts and works with your calves. From your experience, how long do you say that producers should really be giving it a shot or seeing if it works? Because I know in some cases, time of year and temperature, as you were mentioning earlier, really have a big impact on the how well they work, or if even that is an issue at certain times of years. Because I'm just thinking about salmonella specifically, it can be an issue all year, but really has a time when it rears its ugly head, if you will.
Sure. No, absolutely. That's a great question. And, I guess the answer is always it depends, right? But that's where, first and foremost, if you're able to, if you're working with a company that already has sound research, that obviously is going to be a huge impact that we know on average it tends to be better here versus there, those kind of situations. And that will help guide you. And for your own farm, it's going to depend. And that's where working with, hopefully working with a company that can understand your situation. If we're talking about maybe my problem is high pathogens, and we know that that's something that's pretty common. If we're going to add a probiotic, that should be something you're going to see an impact pretty quickly. If we're talking about maybe this, lower health, better health, simple, and we're kind of just doing supportive. I think the biggest thing is just kind of going a couple weeks and making sure we're not seeing anything negative coming out of it. That we're not seeing any GI upset. We're not seeing, any calves going off feed if we're adding something to, their milk or their starter. But so working with your calf specialist, and they should be able to help set expectations for each situation of, this should resolve within this time, or this is something that we're just going to have to kind of go the whole season and see how it plays out.
I have to say, if this isn't the one of the biggest case scenarios where having the right people on your team really does matter, it feels like this is one of them. I'm gonna head to one of the next questions here. This one came pretty early on in the conversation, and it was when you're showing the graphs with the different milk replacer types at high plain nutrition and conventional nutrition. And this one reads, in energy used from conventional to high plain nutrition graphs, you mentioned it was with feeding milk replacer. Would these would this still hold true with pasteurized waste milk? Let me know if you need me to read it again because I
Yeah,
really,
no.
really started butchering it.
Um, yes. So the higher the energy, so yes, I understand the question. So if you're feeding, part of it is, a lot of people are going to say, okay, with the 2.5 pounds, you're feeding more volume of water. So if we're talking about hydration, that has a small impact, but it is important to note that those calves did also have significant access to electrolytes. So I would say our ability to hydrate them was equal in that trial. And so when we're thinking about pasteurized milk, the at that point we're talking about total calories essentially. So if we're talking about feeding 2 quarts twice a day of pasteurized milk versus 3 quarts twice a day or higher, you will see a difference because hydration had a role. So that was, kind of where, if we have dehydrated calves, we're definitely going to have an increase in mortality. But if we get calves more calories, so total pounds of solids, whatever it is, then we feed the immune system. The immune system can help in that specific case. The immune system can help fight the crypto faster. Because remember we had scours resolving 10 times faster. They started with the same pathogen load. So higher energy is going to feed the immune system and feed the calf. And so yeah, the same concept that about getting calories into them and also electrolytes or some sort of water is also the kind of the added part benefit there.
Okay, thank you. Next question here reads, are pre and probiotics only helpful in the preventing stage? For example, if I have sick calves, are pre and probiotics ineffective, and or even potentially harmful at this point? Sorry, there was a word that was combined together there.
So I guess I think the question is essentially preventative versus more treatment.
Sounds like.
I I like them as preventative. I think everything's good as preventative. There is a to me in my perfect world, if I was feeding my own calves, I would have that baseline, that everyday level of a pre and probiotic, and then have something for, they're not always going to catch everything, and then have something that I feed at a 2x level or, something like one of those pastes or an add-in that you do use more as a treatment. Um, and again, it's a level that we wouldn't want to feed constantly because, that's when we get to that overstimulating the immune system. Um, One of the concerns with using, to me, of using a prebiotic or probiotic or prebiotic combination is they do have, as a treatment, they do have a little bit of an impact on kind of upsetting the gut just because it's a new bug and it changes the system. So if we're feeding it, if we are not feeding any of these products, and then all of a sudden the calf is sick, so we already have dysbiosis, the gut's already a little bit upset, and then we add even more things in there. I think they will still help, if you have the right probiotic that's going to help fight that specific pathogen. It will help fight that pathogen, but I think you risk, you're kind of just adding a little more insult. And when we talked about the too much and the gas and those kind of things, we now have, I think, a higher baseline of those bacteria that they have to kill. And during that process, you do create a little bit of, excess gas and those dead bacteria cells. I think sometimes can actually cause a little bit of spike in scouring, especially the first day or two, because if you're killing off cells, we have some of that osmotic effect. And that's what I actually, a lot of times, if I have a farm that's kind of treating with a probiotic, I will tell them to expect what I would call like a flushing effect. It's a very nice word for, increased scours because essentially we're killing off a bunch of things. We're really kind of shifting that rumen microbiome pretty quickly in a way that's a little disruptive. Long term is going to be benefit, but I think the flow of that treatment is a lot better if we already have some of those bacteria in there, and so we're not having quite a huge shift when on top of having like a pathogen problem.
Well, thank you for diving into that. That I think really hit all points you could think of when potentially utilizing pre and probiotics in terms of preventative versus sick versus using it the whole time versus part of the time. So I appreciate that when going through here. And finally, last question of the day for you, Jill, is when thinking about today's conversation, because you had a lot of really good information and a lot of things to be thinking about, but what's one or two things that you want producers to think about or actively do after today's discussion?
Yeah. I think the key would be, really spending time thinking about your specific facility. And I would encourage you to, do it with whoever your calf specialist is, nutritionist, vet, bring in the whole team, right? And really think about, where does our farm fit in this? And then once you have that baseline, think about, and it just, I think baby steps, right? Like I gave a lot of options here. What is the one biggest thing that we could fix here or support? Because again, some of these, if you're kind of sitting there and saying like, definitely on the not that stressed, a lot of these pre and probiotics again are helping, with rumen fermentation and those kind of things. And so maybe it's just that angle. So kind of getting your baseline and really understanding where you are. And maybe it's cyclical, right? Maybe you tend to really struggle in a certain season, and you want to think about preventative, for that kind of a specific season. But thinking about where you are and then thinking about one change that you could make that would really help you and your calves, right? We all know that every farm, people are so much happier when they're taking care of happy, healthy calves. And we know that, our consumer wants healthier calves. We all want healthier calves. So how can we make this just a little bit easier on everybody?
Well, Jill, I have to say today's discussion, it has me thinking just a lot about what can we be really actively doing and thinking about not only on our farms, but in the different situations that we occur throughout the year to better support our calves. So I appreciate your time here this afternoon, especially with the really actionable and tangible things that we can be asking our reps and our team to really be trying to make sure that these calves are as healthy and productive as they can be throughout their life. So thank you so much for your time here this afternoon.
No, thank you for having me.
I also have to say, as we wrap up here today, for the folks who are watching, obviously you are into making sure your calves are going to have the most productive and best life possible. And if you're somebody who is watching thinking, gosh, how can I get more calf information in my life? Because you can never have too much. I'm going to recommend that you head over to our business conference here on March 4th and 5th in Madison, Wisconsin. You can learn more about what's going on specifically by heading over to our website. But if you're somebody who's thinking, gosh, what's calf related? We have a panel with vets and peers alike who are thinking, gosh, what are some of the ways that we can tweak or make little changes to have big impacts? We also have a really great hands-on hub that is about precision calf health, that is really great hands-on actions that you can take immediately back to your farm, and so much more. So head over to our website to learn more and to register. But for now, thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We'll see you here next week. Bye now.